A case study in elite panic. San Francisco and the 1918 flu. Do full lockdowns actually save lives? The New York City antibody test, we've got updates for you on that. Plus a sting operation in Texas for painting nails. General Flynn was set up. And why were there no Sunday questions about Biden's sexual assault allegation? That and more coming up.
I want to review that timetable because when I heard Mitch on the floor the other day, he was saying we have all these things in here that we asked for. No, you rejected. No, you rejected. And speaking of Mitch, what's gotten into him? Well, it's an indication. The president is asking people to inject Lysol into their lungs, and Mitch is saying that states should go bankrupt. It's a clear, visible, within 24 hours of how the Republicans reject science and reject governance. If you don't believe in science and you don't believe in governance, that's their approach. And we do not. We don't want any more government than we need, but we know that governance has a role. And we know that science has a role. And without science in our decision making, we are not going to be on a very successful path.
Nancy Pelosi is a stupid person's idea of what an intelligent politician sounds like. Welcome to the Buck Sexton Show, everybody. Thank you very much for joining. I trust you had a relaxing and rejuvenating weekend, or at least I hope you did. Some of you, I'm sure, were on the work line, doing things, making sure that you were on the front lines, and making sure that food is delivered, making sure that people are getting taken care of in hospitals, doing all the things that we need to have happening to keep this country going. But for the rest of you, I will have my thoughts for you on Netflix and some of the latest there. But first, I want to get into where we are right now in this whole process, because, you know, Pelosi there telling us about how there's no science, there's no governance for the Republicans. How can someone say something that is so devoid of underlying facts, that is just so bizarrely disconnected from reality, and no one seems to bat an eyelash about it? It's certainly no Democrats do. They have no problem with this whatsoever. They view the whole thing as entirely justified. There's no governance. There's no science with the Republicans. The president is standing up for 2 hours a day. He actually might not be doing it quite so much and for so long pretty soon, because I think people are feeling like he might be a little bit overexposed with all this. But the president is doing these things. He's having these press conferences, and they're claiming that he does not have, you know, governance going on. He doesn't listen to science. He's got scientists that are basically running the briefings. Okay, it's the scientists. They're the ones that are actually doing the briefings for the most part, and he just gets up there and tries to bring it all together. But this is the kind of stupidity that we expect from the Democrat left, the same Democrat left that has put now credibly accused sexual assaulter Joe Biden, and man who is perpetually confused and deeply unimpressive. He's the answer. Sure, these people are unserious. The Democrats, they've always been unserious. They never learn, and they will never change. So we need to understand that. They haven't gotten better because we're in a crisis. They haven't gotten more honest. This is just who they are. So we will have to accept that, I suppose, as much as one can, while trying to defeat them and do everything we can to make sure they do not once again wield power. I had a fascinating read for you over the weekend that I picked up by James Meigs, I believe. I've never heard of or read anything by him, and I had to Ben Domenech, who was sharing this from the Federalist. This was in Commentary magazine, though, and it's "Elite Panic versus the Resilient Populace" is the title of the piece by James Meigs here, and it's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. I highly recommend it. We'll share it on some of our social platforms so you can see this piece. He talks about how in 1964, North America had its strongest recorded earthquake just off the coast of Alaska on March 27th, 1964. So a month ago today, back in 1964, the shaking from the magnitude, or a month earlier in the year, the shaking from this quake was 9.2 on the Richter scale, and it shook for 4.5 minutes. He writes that the tectonic forces reshaped Alaska's coastline and triggered tsunamis that wiped out villages and claimed lives as far south as California. Anchorage, which was the main city, the closest city to the epicenter of the earthquake, was home to 100,000 people, and buildings were just completely destroyed all over Anchorage. I mean, just collapsed, caved in. Buildings were rumbling down the sides of embankments after there was just earth moving, the soil moving beneath them. There was a brand new J.C. Penney department store that was collapsing. Parts of it were just completely falling apart. I've been to Anchorage, and it's a nice town. I actually really liked it there. And I know we're on KENI, which is our wonderful affiliate up in Anchorage, that actually comes up in this story. So big high five to KENI, our Anchorage, Alaska affiliate for the Buck Sexton Show, because back in 1964, that was the station that people were turning to for information. That was the first line for folks in the Anchorage area to find out, hey, what's going on? Who's missing? Where do they need help? But officials immediately, and this is what this piece in Commentary Magazine talks about, officials began worrying about the response from people. They thought to themselves, wait a second, there's going to be looting. There's going to be rioting. This is terrible. What can we do? And so they deputized a number of people on the spot, including giving some of them firearms, to say, hey, prevent all this looting in the post-disaster environment that we think is going to happen. So this is where there were concerns that people would, quote, behave like frightened and unsatisfied children, and that there could be a mass outbreak of hysterical neurosis among the civilian population. That was what the police and some of the authorities in the city assumed would happen. And the author here points out that there are plenty of counterexamples in history. The British response during the Blitz in World War II, the Japanese response after the Fukushima nuclear reactor disaster, which was initially thought to perhaps be it was believed to be much, much worse than it ended up being in terms of the amount of radiation that was let loose. But the author of this piece cites a book. The book is called This Is Chance, The Shaking of an All-American City, A Voice That Held It All Together. And this is in Anchorage. This is about what happened in Anchorage during this period. And Chance, I believe, was a TV and radio announcer, Jeannie Chance, a minor celebrity in Alaska. The earthquake caught her in her car, quote, running a downtown errand with her sons. She saw the mangled body in the rubble. Cars were buried in debris. One station wagon had been crushed almost flat by a concrete slab. Chance could hear a woman's voice coming from inside. A crowd of people was trying to save her, clawing at the slab. Then a man stepped forward to organize the effort. Somehow 2 tow trucks were located. They were able to split the slab partially in 2. Another man climbed into the breach with a cutting torch and carved a hole in the vehicle's roof. The woman was pulled free, gravely injured but alive. She would survive. Chance later marveled that all the people involved in the operation were mere passers-by, impromptu volunteers, and yet they functioned as a team. Though she didn't know it at the time, this dynamic was being replicated all over the city. Chance made her first broadcast as soon as her radio station, KENI, came back on air. End quote. That's right, KENI, the same station that folks up in Alaska are listening to us on right now, up in Anchorage. But that was the station that she was able to use to get the word out to people about rescue efforts. Now, remember, there was the official rescue effort, and there was the civilian rescue effort that was going on. People all over Anchorage back in 1964 doing everything that they could to try to save lives, try to pick people out of the rubble. And it was impromptu. It was on the spot. Chance, quote, set up a broadcast desk at the Anchorage Public Safety Building, home to the city's police and fire department. City employees hurried in and out, and civilian volunteers as well. Everyone, it seemed, had a message they needed a chance to read on the air. A high-voltage power line is down on Northern Lights Boulevard. There's a large crevice on Seward Highway. Both highways out of Anchorage are closed. There wasn't much comfort of the news Chance and her fellow broadcasters were conveying. But Anchorage residents remember those voices as a lifeline. Information, one would later say, is a form of comfort. Another called KENI, our only beacon of light in a night of terror. End quote. Fascinating, isn't it? So the official response from the authorities was what people would call, in the disaster study area, elite panic. The elites, right off the bat, generally assume, not always, but will generally assume that people will react terribly the moment that their sense of normalcy is shattered. Otherwise, good, decent, law-abiding people will either be terrified or will act out badly and will not be, you cannot count on them to do helpful things. And it's up to the authorities to make all the decisions for them. I think you're starting to see a little bit of a comparison here, aren't you? Elite panic is when the authorities believe that citizens will become dangerous. So, quote, they begin to focus on controlling the public rather than on addressing the disaster itself. They clamp down on information, restrict freedom of movement, and devote unnecessary energy to enforcing laws they assume are about to be broken. These strategies don't just waste resources, they also undermine the public's capacity for resilient behaviors. In other words, nervous officials can actively impede the ordinary people trying to help themselves and their neighbors. End quote. Yeah, you don't say. So here, the city of Anchorage in Alaska, with 100,000 residents, gets hit with an over 9.0 earthquake, which is an absolutely stunningly devastating I keep wanting to say hurricane. Earthquake. It's stunningly devastating. And yet they were able to band together, the people of Anchorage, with a little help of coordination at the top, courtesy of our affiliate KENI. They were able to direct people. And do you know how many ended up actually dying in that earthquake? 5. Now, that's obviously a tragedy for those 5 people and their families, but from what could have happened, given all the people that were picked out of rubble, it's really astonishing. But human beings, especially in good, healthy societies, which ours is, despite all the criticisms that we can have for America, despite all of our shortcomings here and there, overall, we are a good country filled with good people. When we're given the opportunity, we will more often than not do good things. But the government doesn't always seem to think so. And this is how you have sting operations against nail salons. This is how people can be chased down on the beach for being completely alone and going for a jog. This is how you have some of the absolutely absurd enforcement of regulations that they say are meant to keep us safe, meant to keep us healthy. But no serious person could ever think that they would have that effect. Why are they doing these things? Why are they putting us through this? These are questions that we should demand answers to, because right now we're being told something that's very troubling. It was a few weeks ago that the data dictated that we had to do whatever the government told us, and that we could not be counted on. We could not be counted on to be responsible citizens who would take mitigation measures ourselves, allow businesses to adapt and create safer environments, but still be able to continue in business. No, mandates, lockdowns across the board, across the country. Well, now we have data about those lockdowns, and it does not look good for the across-the-board lockdown chorus. There are some places, New York being the most notable one, where it might have been justified because of the extreme nature of the infection, but even then only justified for a short period of time. But in other places, the lockdown has been, if anything, counterproductive. And if you look at Europe, where they've had essentially a control group with Sweden versus other countries in Europe, Sweden is in the middle of the pack. Sweden is not worse off. In fact, it's better off on a per capita basis than Italy, than Spain, than the UK. It's slightly worse off than Finland or Denmark, but they didn't shut down their society. And everyone's pointing now to the economic impact of it there and saying, well, their economy still got hurt. And you hear this now. Well, the economy won't come back online because people are too scared. Well, you know what would make people less scared? If they started to see other people go to stores and be okay, and other businesses start to operate, and life start to return to normal. Not normal right away, but normal in phases. That has to happen. That's where we are. And we need to start having authorities give the American people greater latitude to make good decisions, to be helpful to each other in our day-to-day lives, and stop this insanity of everything that they say must be done and not be questioned because they have the answers. They've already shown us they don't have the answers. They absolutely do not. The data was used to tell us stay inside or else weeks ago. Now the data shows that in many places and in many cases, that was not necessary and perhaps counterproductive. Where's the focus on that now? Where are all of our so-called firefighter journos running toward the flames for the betterment of our republic? They got no answers for this, do they? We're heading into a different phase, my friends. We had demands for government action because people were scared and the government saw an opportunity to use its power. And now we have overreach, ineptitude, and a complete lack of accountability for bad decisions that government is making. Enough is enough. Let's actually start making some good decisions, and let's allow the American people to be a bigger part of that process. Team, I've got to tell you, I just started with it, and Jack Carr's Savage Son is amazing. You've got to go download the Savage Son audiobook. It's the latest in best-selling author Jack Carr's Terminal List series. The Savage Son explodes with action and authenticity. Jack Carr's a former SEAL. He knows what he's talking about with this stuff, and he explores the darkest instincts of humanity through the eyes of a man who has seen both the best and the worst of it. You got to check out Savage Son, available wherever audiobooks are sold. I'm telling you, even just the first chapter where you have the hunt of a human being underway, it's stunningly well written. It grips you. The action is intense. It's a great way to spend some time these days in quarantine. Listen to Jack Carr's Savage Son, the audiobook you can download now anywhere you can get audiobooks. Savage Son, the latest in Jack Carr's Terminal List series. Download that audiobook. And also remember, the audiobook is read by Ray Porter, so it's fantastic quality. Check it out. Savage Son. Download it today. Again, on this wonderful piece in Commentary Magazine by James Meigs, it's really a fascinating story, and I love that it's at the center of it all. I mean, there's the everyday heroes who are using blowtorches and pickup trucks impromptu. Just, I happen to have my blowtorch in the back. I happen to have, earth-moving equipment that I can use to save somebody from the rubble all over Anchorage back in 1964. And also, it's kind of cool that the coordination and operations center for this whole thing was our affiliate for the Buck Sexton show in Anchorage, KENI. So they must feel pretty darn good about that. But there's other more recent examples too. The piece goes into the situation in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. There were all these stories about the horrific violence and looting, and there were some bad things that happened there. But there was also a lot of coming together, a lot of community. I mean, the Cajun Navy was just amazing. Hundreds of boats, private citizens are saying, "I'm there, man. I'm showing up and I'm helping everybody I can help." Hundreds of boats getting people out of floodwaters and saving lives and coordinating with. And this is not to say that first responders are not essential, doing incredible work. Of course they are. But while the first responders are doing things, there are also a lot of citizens, a lot of civilians who step up and do important things. They often work together. And the impulse of authority, though, and this brings us back to elite panic, is, the people cannot be trusted, so we must have a very firm hand with them. And this is particularly the impulse of unaccountable bureaucracies and regulatory boards and bodies. Things like the FDA, which in the early days of this coronavirus pandemic, the FDA slowed down testing because they couldn't figure out that the regulations they had were not necessary given the scope and the problems that we're facing right now with coronavirus. They couldn't figure it out in time, so they slowed down the whole testing process. Again, the elites panic while the people actually try to do something to help each other. Remember that.
No, and it's outrageous for Senator McConnell to even suggest that. The fact of the matter is, our general fund budget, when adjusted for inflation, is the same size it was when Richard Nixon was our president. We have been incredibly smart stewards. We have not made some of the investments I think we should have as a state because of this artificially low number that we've been working with. But the fact of the matter is that for Senator McConnell to suggest that is incredibly dangerous. And I don't think that the vast majority of governors in this country, Republican and Democratic, would agree with him. He's wrong, and we need Congress to step up and help states, because this pandemic, it's because of this global pandemic that we are all having to make tough decisions. We need the federal government to have our backs.
Governor Whitmer of Michigan has become among the best known of the overreach folks in all of this. I think that's fair to say. She is somebody who has come to our attention for being willing to have the most petty tyranny in the most obvious ways as being a governor. You did have that interview that Tucker Carlson did some weeks ago with the Governor Murphy of New Jersey, in which he's like, well, that's above my pay grade. Why did you suspend the Bill of Rights, Governor Murphy? Well, that's above my pay grade. That was the conversation with Tucker. And to that, one would say, well, no, it's not, because you're the governor and you have a responsibility to protect the Bill of Rights, and you cannot override it as a state official. But we've seen a lot of that. And I want to remind you all now that we were told certain things about why we had to just accept this. We were told this as a country. We were told this for really all 50 states. There were only a handful that did not go with statewide lockdowns. And now we have more data and more information, and we're supposed to forget that we were told things that weren't true, to take actions that did not protect us, that did not help us or save us. And you would think that this would be a point for the journos to stand up and say, well, hold on a minute. Maybe we need to rethink some of this. But nope, because the lockdown consensus has also become very much melded in with the anti-Trump left and the critics of the Trump administration. So lockdown has become political in a way that you can't avoid this. You can't pretend that it's not happening, because this is, in fact, a primary goal for a lot of the people who are pushing for lockdowns across the country, to make sure that the Trump administration suffers. Because what they're able to do here is they're able to put all the blame on Trump, feel like they're saving lives in the process, and ensure that there is catastrophic economic damage. Now, people could say, well, Buck, why do they do this? Why do they do this in Europe? And I say, yeah, why do they do this in Europe, considering that European countries are opening up right now? So the lockdown forever folks are just wrong. I mean, they're not doing this in Europe much longer. They are opening up schools. They are opening up businesses. And I keep pointing to Sweden, not because I have some obsession with Stockholm, but I don't have Stockholm syndrome. But no, because the Swedes were the only ones who were able to be a control group for all the measures that we were told needed to happen. They didn't do it, and they basically went through what the countries that did do it, meaning the lockdown, they had a very similar outcome. In fact, a better outcome than the countries with the most severe restrictions, like Italy and Spain. What we really see is, if nothing else, by the time the authorities recognize that a lockdown is needed, it's too late. And now what we're seeing is, by the time it's clear, or it should be clear to everybody, the lockdown's gone on too long, the authorities don't want to lift it. That is where we are right now. So this brings me to a fascinating piece in the Wall Street Journal. Do lockdowns save many lives? In most places, the data say no. The speed with which officials shuttered the economy appears not to be a factor in COVID deaths. This is a piece by Joe Malchow, Yanon Weiss, and T.J. Rogers. And here's what they say. Here's the basics of it. Sweden is fighting coronavirus with common sense guidelines that are much less economically destructive than the lockdowns in most U.S. states. Since people over 65 account for about 80% of COVID-19 deaths, Sweden asked only seniors to shelter in place rather than shutting down the rest of the country. And Sweden had no pediatric deaths. It didn't shut down elementary and middle schools. Sweden's containment measures are less onerous than America's, so it can keep them in place longer to prevent COVID-19 from recurring. Sweden did not shut down stores, restaurants, and most businesses, but it did shut down the Volvo automotive plant, which has since reopened, while the Tesla plant in Fremont, California, was shuttered by police and remains closed. How did the Swedes do? They suffered 80 deaths per million 21 days after crossing the 1 per million threshold level. With 10 million people, Sweden's death rate, without a shutdown and massive unemployment, is lower than that of the 7 hardest hit U.S. states: Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Louisiana, Connecticut, Michigan, New York, and New Jersey, all of which, except Louisiana, shut down in 3 days or less. Despite stories about high death rates, Sweden is in the middle of the pack, comparable to France, better than Italy, Spain, and the UK, worse than Finland, Denmark, and Norway. And older people in care homes accounted for half of Sweden's deaths. We should cheer for Sweden to succeed, not ghoulishly bash them. They may prove that many aspects of the U.S. shutdown were mistakes, ineffective but economically devastating, and point the way to correcting them. What have I been telling you all along? How many times have you heard me talk about Sweden on this show? And that there was a rooting against it from people in the media. Oh, the Swedes are heading to disaster. Oh, the Swedes are going to learn the most painful lesson. Reckless what they're doing there. We were pressuring them, meaning that the U.S. media, the international news media organizations, they were pressuring the Swedes to do what all these other countries were doing with the lockdowns. And now we're far enough in this and have enough data to know that was wrong. There would be no benefit for the Swedes to do the lockdown. And now people are telling me, well, the economy in Sweden's been hit. First of all, okay, it's been hit. Does anyone think that is it a better thing or a worse thing for some businesses to be open and some businesses to have revenue in an economy? Better to have no businesses open, no revenue? So clearly, just apply basic sense and logic to this. Clearly, it would be worse for the economy if they had done what all these other places had done. And there is no evidence to suggest that it is markedly worse off from a health and safety and mortality rate. This is now we have our control group and we have our answer. We did not need to shut down all 50 states in this country or close to all 50 states in this country with lockdowns. New York probably needed to be locked down, perhaps the tri-state area, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and there needed to be precautions put in place elsewhere. This is not a, oh, we don't need mitigation or we don't need to take this seriously. Of course not. That's absurd. That's a straw man. No one really thinks that. No one's arguing for that. But tell people that they can't operate businesses. Tell people they can't go to parks. They can't go into public places where they're able to maintain distance and they're in open air. It's absurd. We're shutting down parks at a time when fresh air and open space are essential for mental and physical health. There's been so much wrong here, and only some people have been willing to ask questions along the way. And I'll tell you, even I tired after a few days of being told that I don't care about all the death, that I don't care about, a stupid, vicious, just utterly moronic position that people were taking about anyone who would ask questions by looking at the data, because we make decisions as a society all the time about what is acceptable risk. There's a different thing, too, than risk versus the certainty of something happening, right? We let people drive cars, and everyone hates this example. Oh, it's not a bad example. We let people drive cars, not saying, okay, well, we're going to have, we know that the following people are going to die from this, but we let people drive cars knowing that it is possible that people will die from this. It is possible that there will be additional cases and casualties from COVID-19 once we begin reopening. It's also possible that there really aren't. But we're willing to take that risk because of all the factors involved. This is life. This is how adults make decisions. And we know that you can't have a lockdown forever, so why do we keep hearing people say, oh no, keep it going as long as you have to? There was a transition. They tried to transition. The lockdown consensus makers out there at the major news organizations, and there was this culture of the lockdown that you were seeing from celebrities. Here I am in my Malibu mansion, and I'm telling everybody, you must stay locked down. That's your civic duty. There was a culture of this that was pervasive. But initially, it was don't allow the hospitals to be overwhelmed. There are hospitals now in New York. Another piece in the Wall Street Journal about this. Syracuse, for example, a good-sized city in New York State. The hospitals are mostly empty. Empty. No one can get care. No one was able to do elective surgeries of any kind or do preventative visits to the hospital. I sit here and I wonder, at what point are we going to be able to assess all the people who have teeth rotting out of their head, but you might say, oh, well, who cares about that? Actually, a really bad tooth infection can become very dangerous. People don't necessarily realize this, but dental health can turn into like whole body health real fast. How many people haven't had preventative cancer screenings? How many people haven't had surgeries, earlier interventions that might have led to better outcomes as a result of this? There's so many consequences to the shutdown, which was really just a policy of panic. Isn't it fascinating? We started out this hour talking about the elites panicking because they say we're going to panic, right? That's what elite panic is. Oh my gosh, the hoi polloi will be raging in the streets. What will we ever do? And then their response is what the panic actually comes from. That is the panic, telling us all to stay home indefinitely and not really knowing how they're going to reintegrate us back into our normal lives. How could you have a response more steeped in panic than that? It's crazy, isn't it? And we now see this. We see the numbers. We have the data, and the data does not support what we've been told all along we should be doing across the board. Maybe in New York, because we got hit so badly, because this place where I'm coming to you now, I'm here. I'm living it. I'm around it all the time. I tried to go into a store last night, and my mask wasn't covering my nose. It was only covering my mouth. And a guy gave me the whole, hey, fix your mask thing before I could walk into the store. Now, look, it's a private business. I understand, and I'm willing to comply because that's what the business has been told to do, and they're able to set their own regulations. It's a little bit like no shirt, no shoes, not no shoot. No shirt, no shoes, no service. Well, in New York, it's, no mask, no gloves, no service, or at least no mask, no service. Gloves are optional still, but I don't know how long that will last either. So there's this whole movement in this city toward making this feel more normal for people. You're seeing a lot more of these designer masks and a lot of efforts to make it seem like this is just the way it's going to be for a very long time. Look, we're going into the summer, and I think people will eventually get very tired of having these things on their faces, especially when they realize that your risk, all I do is read the data and the studies all day long. Your risk from outdoor transmission of this, unless somebody is basically in physical contact with you or speaking right into your face where you can feel like the heat of their breath, your risk of physical transmission from this, from all the studies they have so far, outdoors is insignificant. You have risk from everything, right? You have risk of getting a terrible staph infection every time you shave and you cut yourself. And, you could die from a staph infection, but do you stop shaving? This is where we have to remind ourselves that there's no perfect safety. And this reminds me of the conversation we were having as a country after 9/11 and with terrorism. People were saying, well, what do we have to do to make sure this never happens again? Yeah, you can prevent catastrophe with the right measures, or at least you can make it harder for catastrophe like that to occur because of those evil psychopaths of Al-Qaeda. But there's no eliminating all terrorist attacks. We saw this with the rise of the Islamic State and all the lone wolf attacks here. There is no perfect safety. And if you try for perfect safety through state mandates, what you get is the elimination of freedom, and you still have risk. You have risk from whatever it is the state says they're protecting you from, but you also have the risk of a state that has become almost all-powerful, which should terrify people a lot more than pretty much anything else we face out there in the real world. A state going tyrannical, if you look at history, what really gets the body count very high? Tyrannical states. That's worse than pretty much anything we've ever seen. The only exception to that might be the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, and that is something that's also coming up now in these discussions about masks, which I want to transition to for a second. You're seeing a lot of this pop up now, analysis of the pandemic of 1918 and how San Francisco, they say, had this under control. And then they started to ease, and then it all came back, and then things got so much worse. Notice how the NBC News has a piece on this. I'm seeing it all over the place, though. Notice how the goal here has shifted. Now it's lockdowns indefinitely to prevent the second wave. Wait, I thought it was lockdowns to prevent overcrowding of the hospital. And then it was just bend the curve so we have more time to figure out more about the disease and allow our public health and doctors and so on and so forth to get in a better position to deal with this. And now it's, well, no, we have to lock down until we figure out how to prevent a second wave through test and trace. But the test and trace is never going to be anywhere near what it needs to be for us to be able to do what they say we need to be able to do, which is find out when someone has this and everyone they've talked to right away and then contain it. We have 320 million people in this country. Do you think the government's going to be, you think there's any way they would have enough effectiveness in test and trace that really is, that's a realistic option for us? This is all just people changing, constantly changing where the goalposts are on this. And now preventing a second wave? Here's what happened in San Francisco. They talk about the anti-mask league, and people didn't want to wear masks anymore. And there was all this propaganda out there. Quote, the man or woman or child who will not wear a mask now is a dangerous slacker. A public service announcement from the American Red Cross said at the time. This was all in this NBC piece. And then there was the anti-mask league, and the other people were saying that, that masks were not necessary. But here's the problem. They're saying that they were flattening the curve, and then it came back. Flattening the curve indefinitely is called indefinite lockdown under the rules that were being set forward for us, and that destroys society. We can't do that. So they need to stop pretending that indefinite lockdown flattens the curve, and that means that that's what we're going to do, because that's impossible. We're not going to do that. It would be not advisable to do that. But there was a second outbreak here. Look, the states and cities right now are playing a lot of games with this. They're saying they're reopening, but they're really not. They're saying that they have a roadmap, but they're afraid to enact it. This is why states that live in reality and are willing to have leadership that are willing to take appropriate risks and show a little courage here will be what saves us, because other states are just going to sit on this and refuse to move until states that have taken action are okay, which is going to happen.